On the vast continent of Eurasia, there is one country that openly calls Ukraine its enemy, as well as the so-called collective West, globalism, and liberal democratic values in general. And if you think this is Russia, you are deeply mistaken, or rather, it's not just Russia. In this case, we're talking about little Hungary, which you can barely spot on the world map even with a magnifying glass. About Viktor Orban's Hungary, who just like a real padisha has been ruling unchallenged for a decade and a half. But soon a decisive date will come which could put an end to Orban's era and return the country to normal development. Or, on the contrary, finally turn Hungary into a sort of European Belarus. Everything will be decided in the upcoming parliamentary elections, which will take place on April 12th of this year. This day will be decisive not only for determining the future of the state, but also for all of Europe, including Ukraine. Today we will talk about what Orban has turned Hungary into during his years as Prime Minister. We will analyze the essence of the current conflict between Hungary and Ukraine, as well as the conflict between Hungary and the European Union. Is Orban really a kind of Trojan horse for Moscow? And we will also talk about the upcoming Hungarian elections with an analysis of the possible consequences of their results. My name is Semyon, and this is the Mega Show TV channel. Our analysis is always objective and as balanced as possible. Let's go. Let's go. 16 years in power. Before talking about what present-day Orban's Hungary is like, let me mention one very interesting fact that our respected viewers may not know or may not have paid attention to. The thing is, Viktor Orban has already held the position of Prime Minister before, from 1998 to 2002. And since Hungary is a parliamentary republic by its form of government, all real power is concentrated in the hands of the head of government. The president is more of a figurehead there. A ceremonial figure, like the Queen of England. Back then, Orbán pursued a completely different policy. Speaking from a pro-European standpoint, he did everything to make Hungary part of the civilized Euro-Atlantic community. It was during his time, in 1999, that Hungary became a member of NATO, and Orbán considered this the greatest achievement, guaranteeing the country's national security. As for the EU, although the actual accession took place in 2009, all the main preparatory, technical and organizational work in this direction was carried out during Orbán's first term as Prime Minister. And he always insisted that Hungary should become an integral part of the European community. This may seem like fantasy to you, but just as fantastical is the fact that only about 25 years ago, many politicians in the West sincerely considered Putin a liberal, a rationalist, and so on. A fairly progressive type of leader, especially compared to the aging Yeltsin entourage. The same was true for Orban. And there's nothing surprising about this, because in the pursuit of power and holding on to it, many figures quickly forget their former principles and beliefs for the sake of political expediency. Or they initially disguise their dictatorial tendencies under the mask of devotion to democratic values. But let's get back to our Orban. In 2002, he unexpectedly lost the election, and by a narrow margin, gave up the Prime Minister's seat to the Socialists. And after that, he came to the conclusion that you should come to power once and stay there forever. Not shying away from any means to do so, that's why he quickly changed his rhetoric, went back on his previous promises, did a complete turnaround, and voila, turned from a pro-European politician into a staunch Eurosceptic. He can't. And the party, officially known as the Hungarian Civic Alliance, turned from a quite reasonable, moderate center-right party into a right-wing populist and even far-right political force with clear chauvinistic tendencies. That year, fate smiled on Orban again. He regained the Prime Minister's seat, and he hasn't left it since, being re-elected consecutively in 2014, 2018 and 2022. None of the current European leaders, except perhaps Lukashenko, can boast such longevity. As for Russia, for obvious reasons, we do not consider it part of Europe. Such an unusually long time in power for a Western politician is explained by much more than just popular affection. Although Viktor Orban does have significant support among voters, as they say, facts are facts. However, the main factor was that the returning prime minister, over many years, slowly but surely destroyed the democratic rule of law, turning Hungary into a closed autocracy. Very similar, if not to Putin's Russia, then definitely to Lukashenko's Belarus, or Spain during the era of Francisco Franco. When Orban returned to power in 2010, Hungary was a typical European state governed by the rule of law, with a relatively developed democracy and freedom of speech. Although it had its own systemic problems, such as, for example, high corruption, a high level of unemployment, and the migration of young people to the wealthier countries of the EU. However, over the next 16 years, Orban effectively nullified all the achievements of the previous years. First of all, he initiated the adoption of a new constitution for Hungary. It is the most conservative constitution in Europe, resembling laws that were written about 100 years ago. But most importantly, it significantly expanded the powers of the executive branch and limited the ability of parliament and other institutions to control the actions of the government. In this way, the much vaunted system was disrupted, the system of checks and balances which is essential to any democratic state. The next blow was dealt to the independence of the judiciary, effectively placing the courts under the control of the state apparatus. I would like to specifically remind you that the rule of law is one of the fundamental values of the EU. Orban also made sure to protect himself in case his own citizens want to vote him out. For this, the traditional liberal electoral system was essentially dismantled, and a new one was built, tailored specifically for the ruling Fidesz party. This is very reminiscent of Putin's Russia, where everything is set up so that United Russia always wins, regardless of the voters' opinions. And as the cherry on top, the effective takeover of all Hungarian media, making it impossible for opposition forces to get their message across to the masses. And voila! And just like that, democratic Hungary became authoritarian, Viktor Orbán's Hungary, and no one else's. The troublemaker of Europe. The similarity between Orban's and Putin's models of governance lies not only in the fact that formal democratic procedures are regularly held, while real conditions for political competition are almost non-existent, but also in the deliberate imposition of an enemy image on society. This is a kind of consolidating factor for the system, which is used everywhere by almost all dictatorial regimes. After all, to maintain a high approval rating without rapid economic growth, a powerful external or internal enemy is absolutely essential. It is precisely the image of the enemy that allows Orban to play the role of the nation's defender. And any criticism of the government accordingly is equated with treason against the homeland. Doesn't that remind you of anything? And who played the role of the sworn enemy of such a great and powerful country as Hungary? In the early years of Orban's premiership, the American billionaire and philanthropist George Soros, who, by the way, is originally from Hungary, was declared such a dangerous element. Only the lazy haven't heard of his famous Open Society Foundation. For several decades now, this foundation has been providing financial support to thousands, if not tens of thousands, of public organizations in various parts of the world to support justice, education, healthcare, and independent media. It's something of a stronghold against authoritarianism. In Russia, by the way, those who receive money from Soros's foundation are contemptuously called Sorosiata, or grant eaters. But let's get back to the point. So, Orban publicly accused Soros of trying to undermine national sovereignty by funding civil society organizations and liberal initiatives. That is, those organizations that did not obey the authorities and were outside the control of the state apparatus, and therefore were potentially dangerous for any undemocratic regime. And this is doubly cynical, since Orban in his youth back in 1989 actually received a grant from the Soros Foundation for a one-year internship at Oxford University. However, gratitude is certainly not the Hungarian Prime Minister's guiding principle. He organized a targeted nationwide campaign against the so-called behind-the-scenes puppeteer Soros, including an outright smear campaign and persecution of civil society institutions. And the final touch was the expulsion of the world-famous Central European University from Budapest to Vienna. By the way, at one time, hundreds of Ukrainian students studied or interned at this institution every year with funding from the Soros Foundation. But Orban was just warming up before the main fight. Next, the main enemy became the leadership of the European Union, collectively referred to as Damned Brussels. Despite the fact that Hungary is the largest recipient of EU subsidies, meaning it basically lives off the so-called damned Brussels, the core of the structure is portrayed as a new imperial center, something like Moscow during the Soviet era, which of course must be fought against. This became especially clear during the pan-European migration crisis of 2015 when, due to Putin's intervention in the Syrian civil war and the massive bombing of Syrian cities by Russian aviation, millions of refugees poured into the West, into Europe. We have a separate video about this Russian barbarism on our channel, be sure to watch it. And at this critical moment, Orban acted as a sort of defender of Christian Europe from the Islamic invasion, categorically refusing to accept Syrian migrants. And moreover, contrary to all EU bans, he initiated the construction of a 175-kilometer barbed wire fence on the border with Serbia and Croatia. In this, he was clearly following Trump's example. And Orban's recent statements about the purity of Hungarians and preventing the mixing of Europeans and non-Europeans are reminiscent of the laws of Adolf Aloisovich, and to top it off, people of non-traditional sexual orientation are periodically portrayed as enemies of Hungarian statehood. This allows the conservative rural electorate to be consolidated. At the same time, the fight for traditional values automatically portrays the opposition as agents of Western influence. And the ban on legal gender change and the law prohibiting the dissemination of information about LGBT people in schools are very reminiscent of the Russian counterparts banning the propaganda of homosexuality. What does Orban have against Ukraine? Now, let's move on to Hungarian-Ukrainian relations. After all, since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukraine has essentially become Orban's main enemy. Although relations began to deteriorate long before that, somewhere around 2017-2018. Back then, Orban accused the Ukrainian authorities of infringing on the rights of ethnic Hungarians living in the Zakarpattia region. There are about 150,000 of them. By the way, not a single European or international organization has ever recorded such cases of discrimination, but apparently Orban knows better from his cellar. And that's why Hungary has been blocking and continues to block any attempts at Ukraine's integration into EU and NATO structures. But when the Moscow horde openly attacked Ukraine, Hungary started attacking from another angle. It began to criticize the sanctions imposed by the European Union against Russia in every possible way and to oppose providing Ukraine with financial and military assistance. Orban has repeatedly claimed that Ukraine needs to stop resisting and instead bow to Moscow and negotiate with the Orthodox Tsar for peace on any terms. That is why Hungary has banned and continues to ban even the transit of weapons through its territory. It constantly blocks the European Union from providing new financial support packages to the victim of Putin's aggression. For example, it put on hold the allocation to Ukraine of the so-called reparations loan amounting to 90 billion euros, which had already been agreed upon back in December 2025. And this is happening at a time when any delay in funding could cost the lives of thousands, if not more, Ukrainian soldiers. But Orban doesn't care about that. Ambitions and the desire to stay in power are above everything else. Well, the final touch in this Hungarian-Ukrainian standoff is the effectively blackmailing Ukraine by using oil as leverage. Hungary is demanding the restoration of Russian oil transit through the Druzhba pipeline, which was actually damaged by Russia itself as a result of drone attacks on the night of January 27, 2026. But Ukraine ended up being blamed. Otherwise, Orban threatens not only to continue slowing down Kyiv's European integration process, but also to completely block any financial aid, even in the form of loans. That seems very fair. Actually, the energy factor needs to be discussed separately. I think I'll prepare a separate video about how Russia uses energy resources as a weapon against Europe and the civilized world. For now, let's note that Hungary, like its neighbor Slovakia, is one of the last remaining importers of Russian oil in the European Union. Other European countries have already found new suppliers for themselves over the past 4 years. But Hungary and Slovakia don't want to look for alternative channels and have even increased their imports of Russian raw materials. They are taking advantage of the fact that when the European Union imposed an oil embargo against Russia at the end of 2022, an exception was made for those countries that have no access to the sea and whose infrastructure relies exclusively on pipeline deliveries. This has been the case since the Soviet era, and which passes through the territory of Ukraine. That is why Hungary and Slovakia continue to be the Trojan horses of the Russian energy machine, if not de jure, then de facto. Between Putin and Trump, speaking about the peculiarities of Orban's Hungary, it is impossible not to mention the countries in relation to these two figures. To begin with, it should be emphasized that Orbán is the only European leader who maintained regular contacts with the Kremlin, even after the 2000s. His demonstrative friendship with the Kremlin's Führer is explained not only by critical energy dependence, but also by clear ideological similarities. Both of them are social conservatives. Both Orbán and Putin position themselves as defenders of traditional values, opponents of the LGBT agenda, globalization, and harsh critics of the liberal dictates of Brussels and Washington. Moreover, Orbán has repeatedly tried to position himself as an effective sort of window between Russia and the West. However, in reality, Putin has actually used Orbán as a tool to undermine the unity of the European Union from within. These aren't just empty words, as the Hungarian Prime Minister's stance objectively benefits the Kremlin, because in the end, it actually slows down and reduces the amount of aid to Ukraine, weakens the sanctions regime, creates an image of division within Europe, and gives Moscow additional propaganda advantages. With Trump, the format of relations is somewhat different. They are openly allied. Orban was the first European leader to support Trump during the 2016 presidential campaign and remained loyal to him even after his defeat by Biden and the attempt to seize the capital. He remained loyal to Donald Fredovich even when it was not acceptable to shake his hand in polite society, and Trump knows how to appreciate loyalty like no one else. Moreover, for many staunch conservative Trump supporters, Hungary's experience in controlling the media, the courts, and dealing with illegal citizens can serve as a perfect guide for possible implementation in the United States itself. Who knows? Elections are coming up. However, no matter how long you spin the thread, the end always turns up. The end comes in the form of another parliamentary election in Hungary, which will take place on April 12th. This time, the possibility of Orbán's defeat is quite real, for the first time in the last 16 years. The main opponent of the ruling Fidesz party is the recently established opposition party TISA. The abbreviation stands for the Party of Respect and Freedom. It is led by 45-year-old Peter Magyar, whom many journalists have already dubbed a friend of Brussels and Kyiv. However, as is always the case, in practice things are a bit more complicated. First of all, it should be emphasized that Magyar himself comes from the ranks of Fidesz. That is, until recently, he was a classic man of the system and adhered to the same conservative principles. His former wife, Judith Várgy, was and remains a devoted supporter of Orbán and held the position of Minister of Justice. However, in 2024, a scandal broke out in Hungary related to the pardon of János Vásárhely, the deputy director of an orphanage, who was accused of pedophilia. As a result, the president of Hungary, Katalin Novák, who signed the pardon, and Judith Várgy, who prepared all the necessary documents, were forced to resign. Orbán himself was formally not involved, since he was not responsible for the pardon procedure. However, during this scandal, accusations were made against the prime minister and the entire leadership of Fidesz. Magyar spoke out, accusing this group of corruption and collusion, and also announced that he had a large amount of compromising material on high-ranking officials in Hungary. After such a démarche, he became Orbán's worst enemy, headed the already mentioned TISA party, and in a very short time gathered numerous protest voters. As a result, the current election campaign has become truly unprecedented in its intensity. Each side presents the outcome of the vote as an existential battle between good and evil. Therefore, the most important issue of this election is the reaction to these very results. In short, will the losing side accept the outcome, or will Hungary plunge into endless protests? However, let's take it step by step. Who's up against whom? Let's start with the fact that, as expected, the topic of Ukraine is one of the central issues in this election. Orbán is basically building his campaign on the idea of not letting Hungary get dragged into the war, while at the same time accusing the opposition of planning to spend Hungarian taxpayers' money on helping Ukraine. Magyar and his supporters accuse Orbán of working for Moscow, and Orbán, in a classic "no you are" move, immediately accuses Magyar of working for Kyiv and Brussels, and accuses the Ukrainian authorities of interfering in the elections and even financing the opposition. Which all looks completely absurd. Especially considering the total money crunch in Ukraine across almost all sectors, the authorities
деятельности.
naturally completely deny all these claims, although they don't hide their interest in a defeat of Orbán, who has long been Ukraine's main opponent in Europe and stands in the way of its further European integration. Moreover, Orban has repeatedly stated publicly that Hungary will continue to block Ukraine's membership in the European Union for another 100 years. Now let's consider the EU factor. If in foreign policy Orban bets on total confrontation with the leadership of the European Union, then Magyar demonstrates his constructiveness and willingness to seek compromise with Brussels, for which he has been nicknamed the Brussels puppet by pro-government circles. The topic of Ukraine, which is also used against Magyar, is much more complicated. Orban is sharply criticizing Kyiv, calling on Europe to stop helping Ukraine and on Zelensky to make peace as soon as possible on any terms. But the fact is that Magyar also has to take into account in his own campaign that the prevailing opinion in Hungarian society is that the country should stay away from the war. Unfortunately, for most average Hungarians, and not only Hungarians, Ukraine is increasingly associated with a kind of European equivalent of Afghanistan. A territory of constant war, destruction and chaos, and these sentiments are fueled not only by Russian propaganda, but also by the policies of far-right forces throughout Europe. That's why the idea of any assistance to Ukraine, especially military aid, is extremely unpopular in all layers of Hungarian society. That's why Ukraine, war. Magyar is especially careful not to push this issue in his campaign, so as not to put himself at risk. As for the current opinion polls, most of them record an advantage for the opposition, although government-sponsored sociologists still give preference to the ruling Fidesz party. But we shouldn't forget that there's still quite a bit of time left before election day, so the situation could easily turn completely upside down in just a matter of days. So the tension keeps rising, and Hungarian society is splitting in two. There's nothing good about this. What will happen if Orbán is sent into retirement? As you can tell, the upcoming elections are hugely important not only for Hungary and Ukraine themselves, but for all of Europe as a whole. After all, Orbán has long been one of the informal leaders of the European right, opposing the left liberal establishment of the European Union. His retention of power will not only cement the already existing authoritarian regime and finally turn Hungary into a version of Lukashenko's Belarus, but will also significantly strengthen the position of the right as a whole on the continent. The fact is that right now, liberal democratic, center-left and even socialist forces dominate in European countries, and they are generally friendly toward further support for Ukraine. The only exceptions are Italy, led by Giorgia Meloni, Slovakia under Fico, the Czech Republic with Babis, and of course, Hungary. Plus Poland, where since last year the president has been the conservative and Eurosceptic Karl Nawrocki. Meanwhile, the parliament and government remain in the hands of pro-European forces led by Donald Tusk. However, Trump's return to the presidency has already triggered processes that many political analysts and experts call a rightward shift in Europe. Simple examples: a sharp rise in the ratings of Alternative for Germany, the National Rally in France, and until recently the marginal party of Nigel Farage in Britain, all just during 2025. Therefore, Viktor Orbán's victory, given his already excessive penchant for scandal and hyperactive presence on the European stage, will demonstrate that right-wing conservative forces are on the rise. And it will be extremely difficult to stop this rightward shift, if it's even possible at all. And this doesn't bode well for Ukraine. But if Orbán is ultimately sent into political retirement, this will significantly change the current balance of power in Europe, and the rightward shift will essentially fizzle out. Hungary will gradually return to normal development, and across the continent, the consolidation of liberal and democratic forces will strengthen, which will only benefit Ukraine. There will be a higher chance of full EU membership and fewer of Putin's Trojan horses. However, it is quite likely that neither side will admit defeat and will accuse their opponents of falsifying the vote count, especially if the margin is within a few percentage points. In that case, Hungary will almost certainly face its own Maidan, similar to the Orange Revolution of 2004. And then, the outcome of such turmoil will be extremely difficult to predict, ranging from months-long court battles to armed clashes and even a full-scale civil war. The last scenario, however, seems to me the least likely. We continue to monitor the progress of Hungary's parliamentary elections. Let's hope its citizens cast informed and unbiased votes. After all, democracy implies not only freedom but also a high level of responsibility for one's decisions. That's all from me. Thank you for watching, and thank you to all the sponsors for supporting the channel. Without you, it's hard to make such long videos. Goodbye, everyone.